hold on for a second. I'm going to make a little announcement.
Are we starting? Are we starting?
I want to say hello. My name is Alan Gross. You don't know me, but my wife is Joan Mandel. Oh. She was her classmate at Valley.
Mike?
Yes.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome. Please take your seats. We're going to enjoy some more music while people are seating. We still have people, I think, coming in, but it'd be wonderful if you can take seats. I know everybody's excited to be together. Some of you have not seen each other in years. So this is a wonderful opportunity, but we're going to be assembling and getting people ready. We'll be starting the program shortly. Thank you. All right.
Can we play one more thing before we do? Should we start at the top? We could, because I don't have. We're going to do Hatikva. The last thing we'll do is Hatikva. I have no idea how many minutes he wants us to play. Can you get an idea? Deb, can you get an idea of just how many more minutes?
1 minute, 1.5
Just 1 minute more, and they're going to start.
When you're close to starting. Okay, let's. Okay, so we'll do
Okay,
this.
maybe you'll push me more.
Why don't we start with so in others we're not going through it.
No, what we did right now was this to see Ot Testimonio,
Okay,
and then let's do Hatikva.
how lovely it is to be here with you today, to be among families and descendants of our founding families, people involved in the Soviet Jewry Movement. This is really a proud day for Beth Israel. I'm the president, Walter Wright, the president of Beth Israel-The West Temple. And what started here in the early 60s became a national movement to help Jews leave the Soviet Union, where they were able to live free and practice their religion. Some of the people you will hear from today were present at the beginning or are family members of those who were. It's a proud legacy for us, some of us too young to remember this modern-day exodus. Without the hard work of the people of Beth Israel-The West Temple of a generation ago, none of this may have happened. As we remember, we commit to Tikkun Olam, repair the world. I also want to thank our musicians, Gene Epstein, Jim Karen, Wendy Karen Zohar, who are themselves children of people who are involved in this movement. And now I'd like to welcome to the podium Rabbi Rachel Brown.
Bruchim Habaim, welcome. I want to say, welcome to our celebration. But it's hard to feel like celebrating today. 2 weeks ago and earlier, today was to be a grand celebration with us coming from all over the world to dedicate Beth Israel-The West Temple's historical marker commemorating our activism in freeing the refuseniks. We are all here today, either in person or online, and we are here to dedicate our historical marker. But our anticipated celebration turned slightly into something else, maybe more than slightly, 2 weeks ago, when we were thrown into a state of mourning and sadness. So today is part celebration and part just coming together. We are here to dedicate the placement of the marker. We are here to recognize how important it was years ago to mobilize the Jewish community in the free world to help free refuseniks in the Soviet Union. And we are here today to come together as a Jewish community to hold each other up. It is a blessing that we are all here today. With the devastation wrought on us by the events of the past 2 weeks, it would have been easy to cancel our gathering today. But we can hold both. Our tradition is experienced with moving through times of gladness even during sadness. When someone dies, we sit Shiva for 1 week. We continue in a state of mourning for 1 month. And we refrain from attending parties for 11 months. But even within that week, month, or year, we still celebrate Jewish festivals and Shabbat. We attend weddings. We don't let sadness and mourning completely hijack our times of gathering for celebration, even if the celebration has to be a little bit muted, as it is today. Our focus today on the way we used our collective voice to free those who couldn't free themselves gives us hope. In 1963, as an offshoot of the Social Action Committee at Beth Israel-The West Temple, the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism was established. Even today, we are able to look at the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism's work and know that we are also powerful. We hold each other up in hope and love, knowing that we have the power to speak up against what is unjust, and that enough of us, speaking loud enough, can bring justice. My hope is for justice that allows people to live without fear, free to go about their daily business in peace, just as we worked for the refuseniks of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. All of us are mixed up with and responsible for one another. Today, we come together to mark how powerful it was to come together to free Soviet Jews back then and to hold each other up now. So welcome. Bruchim habaim. Thank you for coming, for holding each other up, and for marking this incredibly important movement to free refuseniks that was started by members of Beth Israel-The West Temple in the 1960s.
Welcome to everyone who has joined us today here in Cleveland and those who are watching from locations around the world. My name is Miriam Rosenblum. I grew up here on Cleveland's west side, and like many of the people we will speak about today, I was an activist in this movement for many years and have recently renewed that activism in order to share this important history with future generations. We are honored to have with us today former American activists, former refuseniks from the former Soviet Union, and academics who will share stories about the Soviet Jewry Movement and describe today's work to preserve these stories. Today, we recognize the Cleveland pioneers whose passion ignited a grassroots human rights campaign that became a worldwide movement. Today, we are recounting the events that took place more than 60 years ago when a small group of individuals right here at Beth Israel-The West Temple began to research, to question, and then to act on behalf of 3 million fellow Jews in the former Soviet Union. And today, we honor the many others who also joined this fight. In 1961, the horrors of the Holocaust, the deaths of 6 million Jews and millions of non-Jews at the hands of the Nazis, it was recent and still unfolding. Members of this Temple Social Action Committee absorbed all available information, including how the United States and the rest of the world had failed to act. Then they asked, were there any other threatened Jewish communities around the world? Their research pointed them to the 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union. These Cleveland pioneers brought their concerns to the leaders of the American Jewish community. They were rebuffed, told that the issue was being taken care of. They need not be concerned. But the audacity and determination of this small group from Cleveland's west side was strong. They knew that American Jews should not, could not remain silent a second time. They were responsible for their fellow Jews in the Soviet Union, and so they persevered. In early 1963, they wrote to the White House to President Kennedy. They appealed to the wider community in Cleveland and across the United States. They reached around the world to top thinkers and activists of the time, and they found allies for the nascent movement. By October of 1963, they formed the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism with an interracial and interfaith leadership coalition. The Cleveland Committee, soon renamed the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism, was the first independent group formed to advocate for Jews in the Soviet Union. The CCSA's pioneering work in Cleveland was the beginning of the grassroots Soviet Jewry movement in North America and beyond. No one could have imagined that this movement would spread and endure, that the movement would draw in thousands upon thousands of individuals in North America and across the Western world, that the movement would join forces with and impact thousands upon thousands of Jews in the Soviet Union who battled from their side of the Iron Curtain for the right to emigrate and live as Jews. And that the movement would ultimately span 30 years before it finally reached its goals. Let's step back for a minute so we can fully appreciate what the early pioneers in the Soviet Jewry movement faced. It's the early 1960s. It's the Cold War, a period of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union and their respective allies. The Iron Curtain is firmly in place. It's a virtual wall. It separates the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe from the West. During these earliest years of the Soviet Jewry movement, there was little possibility of direct communication between Jews in the West and Jews behind the Iron Curtain. There is simply the understanding that one another is there. And for a small but growing cohort in the West, the growing knowledge that this time they needed to act. And so they did, with rallies, protest marches, and confrontation of Soviet officials. This grassroots activism operating outside of the established Jewish infrastructure was a pioneering and powerful force. The grassroots movement rapidly spread to the East Coast, the West Coast, north to Canada, and across the ocean to the UK, Europe, and Israel. And on the other side of the Iron Curtain, Jews in the Soviet Union began to raise their voices and risk their lives for the right to leave. Slowly, cracks in the Iron Curtain appeared. Connections and networks of communication between Jews in the Soviet Union and those in the West were established. As the Soviet Jewry movement surged into the 1970s, we were able to put names and faces to many of the refuseniks, odkazniki, Jews who had been refused permission to emigrate. The Leningrad hijack trials and other trials and imprisonments of refuseniks led to even more attention in the West. Protests and international demand for freedom of emigration for Soviet Jews accelerated. The movement swelled. Then, American activists fought to pass the Jackson-Vanik Amendment to the Trade Act of 1974, making favorable tariff status for other countries dependent on freedom of emigration and other human rights protections. Lobbying by the grassroots groups eventually resulted in the passage of the amendment, thus potentially costing the Soviet Union hundreds of millions of lost trade dollars if they did not open the gates. Emigration began to increase in ebbs and flow. And the idea for this amendment came from none other than the Cleveland activists in the CCSA working with their Congressman Charles Vanik. Throughout the 1980s, the Soviet Jewry movement swelled again as new generations of activists and refuseniks joined the fight on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Then, in 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and the gates opened. By the turn of the 20th century, 1.6 million Jews had left the Soviet Union, and today that number has reached close to 2 million. And for the Jewish community that remains in former Soviet states, options open for exploring and living a Jewish life. Back in 1963, those earliest pioneers had no inkling of the 3-decade struggle that lay ahead. But they gave their hearts and their souls to this work. These pioneers simply acted on their instincts and sense of tikkun olam, their obligation to repair the world. I invite you now to watch some clips from Michael Rand's 1998 documentary entitled Hear the Cry, where we will hear from 3 leaders of Cleveland's pioneering Soviet Jewry group. Michael Rand gathered Herb Karen, Dan Litt, and Lou Rosenblum right here at Beth Israel-The West Temple, in fact, right here on this location, you'll see, to recount the events of the early 1960s that led to the birth of the Soviet Jewry Movement.
Dr. Louis Rosenblum is a retired NASA scientist. But when he and others formed a small study group back in 1962 at Beth Israel-The West Temple on Triscuit Road, he was a young lion set on making a difference, but still not knowing how. He and two others formed the core of an organization that grew beyond their synagogue to a national and then international movement that nudged the world a little in its spin. Daniel Litt, Louis Rosenblum, and Herbert Karen didn't start out to change the world, but 35 years ago, they were younger and eager to make their mark. Lou Rosenblum was a scientist working at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration's Lewis Research Center, next door to Cleveland Hopkins International Airport. Herb Karen was an adjunct associate professor, teaching psychology at what was then Western Reserve University, and doing research at the Veterans Hospital at University Circle. Today, he's a psychologist practicing in the southern and western suburbs of Cleveland. Dan Litt was then Rabbi Litt, and the spiritual leader of the small congregation of families that made up Beth Israel. He too is now a practicing psychologist in Greater Cleveland. He remembers the beginnings of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism.
Well, things had started a bit earlier, right here in Beth Israel Temple, with this nucleus of a social action committee, small committee of the temple. Many of us were very active in civil rights causes, not only in the city here and in the west side of Cleveland particularly, but also in the Deep South. But somehow this committee very soon began to focus on this issue, the Soviet Jewish issue.
The Jewish community here was very happy with our work on civil rights. So
yes.
That's great. That is Jewish. But Soviet, I think what pushed us over the edge was seeing that nothing had really been done, studied by the Jewish community in the 30s and the early 40s to publicize the beginnings of the Holocaust.
To me, the most telling thing I read was Chaim Greenberg's essay called Bankrupt, which dealt with the period during the Holocaust when the Jewish community in the United States was impotent, confused, and essentially was just irrelevant to any kind of action. It was a tragic abandonment of a responsibility. We had quite a bit of evidence what was going on in the Soviet Union.
I think we started with the idea of the Cleveland Jewish Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism, we call it CCSA, and later it became the foundation of the councils of Louisville.
The three men asked retired NASA Lewis Research Center and founding member of Beth Israel, Abe Silverstein, to serve as titular head of their new organization. The Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism was born. They quickly moved to broaden support outside the Jewish community by asking Cleveland Mayor Ralph Blocher to serve as honorary chairman.
Where we're seeing now is the pulpit area of the sanctuary. Just above us is the choir loft, and in the choir loft we had our CCSA office from about 1964 to about 1978. It could hold 3-4 people perhaps, and there we had Lenore Singer, who was our volunteer secretary over all that period of time.
I guess I have memories of lots of people downstairs in the hall here at Temple Beth Israel, many evenings, many nights, cranking out the old mimeograph machine.
We had young kids, old people, parents, everybody here standing, folding, sealing envelopes, stamping, all this work that had to be done.
The Soviet Jewry Movement was a huge transformational experience for many of us in the Western world. For a huge swath of individuals, the Soviet Jewry Movement became a living lesson in Jewish identity and presented opportunities to make a real difference in the world. Many of you here today or watching online were among the activists who participated in this movement and were forever transformed. And for the many activists who are no longer with us, your work continues to inspire us. Thank you. I'm now going to recognize some of the amazing people who were part of the grassroots efforts of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism. The pioneers who began to question and challenge the status quo, and the generations of Cleveland area people who joined them to lead various initiatives over the years between 1963 and 1991. Their collective passion and dedication was astounding, and everyone I'm about to mention was a volunteer. There were no paid employees, and the sheer number of hours given by these activists was awe-inspiring, to say the least. In the movie clip, you already met Herb Karen, Dan Litt, Lou Rosenblum, and Lenore Singer. And now for others who led the way. Don Bogart, Dave Gitlin, Mort Epstein. On the original 1963 CCSA board were Rabbi Philip Horowitz, Monsignor Lawrence Cahill, the Honorable Leo A. Jackson, and Reverend Bruce Whittemore. Chairs of the CCSA board. The founding chair was Cleveland Mayor Ralph Locher, and then Abe Silverstein. Henry Sloan, Dorothy Silver, Goldie and Ann Robinson. Dan Golden, who pioneered the Greater Cleveland Youth Initiative. Rhoda Rosen and Evie Rosenblum. Students from this temple who were members of the CCSA's Greater Cleveland Youth Initiative. And the Youth Initiative in action as they welcomed the return of two of their own members, Jim Caron and Melaine Abrams, returning from their meeting with Soviet officials at the Soviet Embassy in Washington, D.C., mid-1960s. The members of Beth Israel, from the youngsters to the high school students to the adults, who donated countless hours over many years to get out mailings and fulfill orders for the protest seals, greeting cards, and to distribute the CCSA national newsletter, Spotlight. David Foreman, Judy Foreman, David Sadowski, and Mark Clarfield, who formed the Soviet Jewry Freedom Caravan. In one summer, they visited 60 Jewish summer camps to spread the word. Don Bogart, Herb Karen, and Lou Rosenblum shown again with the CCSA published Soviet Jewry Handbook, which ultimately had 3 editions. And to introduce the next image, I quote from my father, Lou Rosenblum's own writing. This photo is the theme shot for the 1968 motion picture Before Our Eyes, an expose of the plight of Soviet Jewry. Filming in the USSR in the 60s was not an option, so casting was done close to home, with filming in Cleveland and New York. 4 members of Cleveland's Beth Israel-The West Temple were enlisted to model a Soviet Jewish family. So you see from left to right, Ed Alt, Miriam Rosenblum, Bob Hoffman, and Alice Mark. The film was an undertaking of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism with financial assistance from the Jewish Community Federation of Cleveland. It was directed by Mort Epstein and produced by Lou Rosenblum. Before Our Eyes was screened widely in the US and Canada and overseas in Great Britain and South Africa. Susan Summers, then a student at Oberlin College, who assisted with phone communications using her Russian language skills, speaking with those in the Soviet Union. Henry Margolis and Ruven Yalon, then with the organization known as the Bureau of Jewish Education, now known as the Jewish Education Center of Cleveland. These 2 gentlemen developed Hebrew learning materials for the refuseniks that were then sent in with travelers going to meet refuseniks. Maish Mandel, another activist, and Carol Mandel, who spearheaded what was called Action Central, designed to rapidly disseminate breaking news and action plans across the country. Aida Warshay and Marvin Warshay coordinated sending packages to Jews imprisoned in Soviet labor camps. Alan Riga, who led the CCSA through the 1980s. And a special mention about Sidney Vinson, not a grassroots volunteer, but the executive director of the Cleveland Jewish Community Federation in the 1960s. And again, I quote from my father's writing. In 1966, the Jewish Community Federation of Cleveland became the first federation in the United States to allocate funds for this issue by providing support for the CCSA's educational activities. And I'll add that this support continued for many years. And circling back to Mort Epstein, let's remember the iconic images he created in the 1960s to propel this movement. Here are some samples. The red iconic protest seals that ended up on mail all over the United States. The rally poster you see on the right, and also the buttons, I am my brother's keeper. These Cleveland pioneers ignited a grassroots movement that ultimately moved governments. One of the earliest pioneers and a founder of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism, Dan Litt, is virtually with us today. Hello, Dan. I'm watching on the live stream. His children are here with us. And I was going to ask Dan to wave, but do that virtually. And we have a number of activists who were part of the CCSA's many years of work have also joined us. As the movie Hear the Cry said, your work nudged the world a little bit in its spin. If you are able, I invite everyone who's here with us today who led, who volunteered in some way with the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism to stand now and accept our thanks. So please. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Shaul Kellner of Vanderbilt University. Dr. Kellner specializes in the sociology of the contemporary Jewish experience. His research analyzes how culture and politics intersect to shape Jewish life. Dr. Kellner's new book about mass mobilization tactics to free Soviet Jews will be published this spring. And in his spare time, he serves also on the advisory board of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm an historian of the American movement to free Soviet Jews, and I'm honored to be asked to share remarks. What we're commemorating today is important not just for what the Cleveland Committee, Cleveland Council accomplished, but for the enduring lessons that their work carries for us today. Regular citizens, far from the power centers, organized themselves to fight against oppression, ended up stirring millions to act, and succeeded in changing people's lives, in changing Jewish history and world history, and changing the world for the better. Before the members of a book club here in this synagogue launched the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism 60 years ago this month, no one here in the United States, no one, had organized to challenge the oppression of Jews and the suffocation of Jewish life in the Soviet Union. Some of the existing Jewish groups did piecemeal work here and there, but there was no American organization solely devoted to the cause of freeing Soviet Jewry. The CCSA was the first. And this alone was pioneering. But the group did not stop with just being the first. The council leaders seeded grassroots activism in other communities all across the United States. They spearheaded the effort in 1970 to unite all of these grassroots councils into a single national confederation, the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. And Lou Rosenblum served as the UCSJ's first president, and with him at the helm, the UCSJ and the CCA led the Soviet Jewry movement's most consequential shift in mobilization tactics. The shift from speaking about Soviet Jewry in the abstract to speaking about Anatoly Sharansky, Ida Nudel, Yuli Kosharovsky, Abba Taratuta, who we just lost, Alav Shalom, actual Jewish people in the USSR. Thousands of individuals, each with their own name, each with their own story. Lou Rosenblum called the approach people to people, and it shifted the movement from just holding demonstrations to directly and personally engaging Americans with Jews in Russia via prisoner adoption and family adoption, visits to deliver blue jeans to refuseniks, pen pal programs for children, and eventually this led into bar and bat mitzvah twinning. So here was the problem. Put yourself back in 1963. And the folks here in Cleveland know that something needs to be done to aid Soviet Jews. But they also know that a few men in a synagogue book club didn't have the power alone to force the Kremlin to change its policy. And the only one who might have the power was Uncle Sam. But the State Department was not itching to take up this issue. And remember, it was still being led by the same Ivy League clique who back in the 1940s had closed the gates to Jewish refugees fleeing Hitler, and that had advised President Truman not to recognize Israel. There were elected officials, but at the time they were content to pay lip service. And even the big Jewish organizations, as we heard, were reluctant to take this issue on. It's being handled. The larger Cold War stakes were just too high. The CCSA saw this, and they realized what was needed. Pressure. A mass movement of American Jews to pressure Jewish organizations to step up, and to pressure the US government to take on the issue in deed as well as in word, and use carrots and sticks to actually lean on the Soviets so that they would change their policies. And there's a Hebrew word for this, chutzpah. But the entire strategy depended on rousing American Jews. And that meant informing them and motivating them and giving them ways to act. In the 1960s, this was especially hard because the Soviet Jewish problem was far away, it was hard to visualize, there were no vivid images for television, communication across the Iron Curtain was difficult, getting to Russia was even harder. The CCSA in the 1960s tried to address this. It circulated activist handbooks, we saw a picture of it, that contained firsthand testimony from professors who had traveled to Russia and went to visit Jews. It published a national newsletter, The Spotlight, to keep people informed. In the movement's first decade, the CCSA was de facto serving a national role as one of the main organizations keeping American Jews all over the country informed about Soviet Jewry on a regular basis and giving them guidance on what to do, how to organize, how to act, how to make a difference. But imagine that all this was happening at a time when Americans could not name any Soviet Jews. Elie Wiesel wrote about this. He wrote The Jews of Silence in 1986, thought of as the book that galvanized the movement. There was activism before 1966, as we know. But Elie Wiesel in 1966, in his travelogue, The Jews of Silence, writes, "They seem to hover in midair, Chagall-like, floating above the mass of shadows and colors below, above time. The Cleveland Council turned these figures of American Jewish imagination into real people. In 1968, Jews in Russia started signing petitions and sending letters out to the West demanding help in their efforts to emigrate. Some were imprisoned, others were allowed to leave. And all of a sudden, from the letters and from the immigrants, activists here discovered their Soviet Jewish counterparts. And the Cleveland Council seized the moment. They collected names, they collected contact information, they collected stories. Between 1970 and 1974, the Union of Councils, which was operating out of offices right here in Cleveland, in this building, in this room, launched People to People. People to People was a series of actions designed to connect Jews in the US with Jews in the USSR. So first, People to People connected Americans with the petitioners, the Soviet Jews who signed declarations demanding their right to emigrate to Israel. In 1969, the Bay Area Council on Soviet Jewry asked people to mail Rosh Hashanah cards, New Year's cards, to Russian synagogues. And the CCSA took over this project a year later in 1970 and switched gears because they didn't trust, and Lou especially, did not trust Soviet-appointed rabbis to do anything with those greeting cards. And so they asked people to send the greeting cards directly to the people who were petitioning, demanding the right to leave. Lou enlisted help from another Clevelander, Irving Stone, who owned American Greetings Corporation based right here. And the company produced and donated greeting cards with messages in Russian and in English. And CCSA sold tens of thousands of these cards with names and with addresses of the petitioners so that people could mail them directly to them. And then they used that funding to support the CCSA and to support the work of the UCSJ. A year later, also as part of People to People, the CCSA published the first handbook for supporting Jewish prisoners of conscience. Again, names and addresses, but also information about how to send in food and medicine. We saw the packets on the screen. How to do this, what to buy, how to send them, where to send them, and how to support them. Also through People to People, the CCSA was the first to encourage Americans to reach out directly to Soviet Jewish children. The Action Central Network compiled and circulated a list of 40 children of refuseniks, ages 5 to 18 years old, and asked people to encourage their kids to write to them. And other groups picked this up and developed pen pal programs. And a few years later, these pen pal programs evolved into the practice of bar and bat mitzvah twinning, which saw tens of thousands of American 13-year-olds symbolically pair their coming-of-age ceremonies with Refusenik children in absentia. The CCSA's People to People initiative also used phone calls to connect with Soviet Jews, but when the Russian government started cutting the lines, they knew that they needed another way in. And that's how the CCSA ended up taking the lead in early efforts to send American tourists to Russia to directly meet with refuseniks and deliver aid and bring back information. By the end of the Cold War, thousands had gone on these types of trips. But in the early 1970s, connecting people via tourism was brand new. And activists had to figure out how to do this effectively, how to organize it. So Lou Rosenblum, Dan Litt, and others were briefing tourists from Cleveland and from around the country, and you can go to the Western Reserve Historical Society and you can hear the recordings of the briefings and debriefings that they did. And ironically, the big problem was that too many people wanted to go. How do you manage this? And in 1974, the CCSA, Lou, sent Miriam Rosenblum, Sheldon Benjamin over, and they reported back. I'm going to quote from their trip report. "We returned by arrangement to Refusenik Vladimir Slipak's place at about 11 p.m. and had our first taste of the average performance of the average tourist, ignorance, small talk, and overstaying of welcome." And Miriam and Sheldon also passed along criticisms that the refuseniks were leveling themselves. "It's very nice that they come," Ilya Zablonsky said, "but most, quote, most tourists wasted their own time and that of the activists. They were ill-informed or not informed at all about the situation of Soviet Jews, and they did not, in general, bring items of use or value." And that was the problem that the Cleveland Council had to figure out. How do you actually make tourism and these visits serve to actually help? So under UCSJ, Union of Councils auspices, and working with other councils, the Cleveland Council tried to develop strategies to fix the problem. So two of the members, Carol and Maish Mandel, who we also saw here, went over to meet up with Sue Summers, sitting right here, who was an Oberlin student at the time, studying abroad in Leningrad. And she and the Mandels delivered material support, including a gadget that refuseniks could use to hook up to their telephones to record phone calls with activists from the West. So imagine that, smuggling this stuff into the Soviet Union. They also smuggled typewriters in, and amazing things that they did to coordinate activism on both sides of the Iron Curtain. But when they got back, they then tried to work to coordinate a speakers bureau for others who traveled, and the Cleveland Council also piloted projects like Operation Lifeline and Have Guts, Will Travel, and these were programs that tried specifically to recruit tourists, give them defined missions, and to pay for their travel so that they could use tourism effectively and strategically. Some of the things worked better than others. Eventually, other councils took over the work, and the tourism effort grew enormously. So put all this together: greeting cards to petitioners, creating a lifeline to prisoners, pen paling with children, sending Americans directly over to Moscow, to Leningrad, to meet up and to work with, as partners, Soviet Jewish activists, and contrast this with what had been the case before, when for American Jews, Soviet Jewry was just an abstract idea with no names, no faces, and you can see what a revolutionary approach the Cleveland Council's people-to-people was. The Soviet Jewry Movement's key challenge was figuring out ways of mobilizing Americans, not just for a single rally, not just for a month, not just for a year, but for the long haul. And the Cleveland Council solved that problem. Make it personal. Connect real people here with real people there. People who you could write to, people who you could call, people who you could visit, people who you could befriend. And that proved a sustainable formula for keeping people in America engaged, for keeping Jews in the Soviet Union supported, and for keeping the pressure on. As we look back today and we celebrate the power of regular people to change the world for the better, we should remember not just what the Cleveland Council set in motion and accomplished, but how it accomplished it. The Cold War divided the world, but by seeking each other out as partners, people to people, Jews in the US and the USSR found ways to work together across the Iron Curtain, in spite of the Iron Curtain, to bring down the Iron Curtain. And these lessons of solidarity and human connection are as important today as they were then. We've just experienced the worst slaughter of Jews since the Holocaust. Over 1,000 dead, many more wounded, and even more whose lives have been shattered by the loss of these loved ones and friends. And we should not treat them as numbers. Every one of these people has a name. The Jewish tradition teaches each one is a whole world. We have to hold each other in grief, and we have to pick up and build and move forward with determination and with hope. And in both, let us remember what the Cleveland Council and People to People taught, that even though an ocean may separate us, we can accomplish anything when we stand together, when we support each other, person to person, one by one. Shalom al Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai.
Thank you, Shaul. We've been hearing about the efforts of those in the West on behalf of Jews in the Soviet Union, and it is now my pleasure to introduce Etty Ganin. Etty was a refusnik and an activist in the Soviet Union, along with her husband, Alex. And recently, Etty joined the board of directors of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project. Thank you, Etty, for speaking today from the perspective of the refuseniks who battled on your side of the Iron Curtain.
Hello, my name is Etty Ganin, Hebrew pronunciation. And in Russia, I was named Etty Bonder, and my husband Alex, his name was Alek Zhenin. First of all, I wanted to thank all American Jews for all they have done for us when we were voiceless Jews in the Soviet Union. They helped us to get our freedom, and it's priceless. I also wanted to thank all our friends and former activists in Soviet Union, who we always remember and I are grateful to for teaching us our first steps in Judaism and Hebrew when we were students in Leningrad, currently St. Petersburg, in the late 60s. When I searched the archives of the movement that Lou Rosenblum and of blessed memory and his friends, the heroes from this temple, collected, assembled, and donated to Western Reserve Historical Society, I found quite a few documents dating back to the late 60s and later. I found our names and names of our friends in this archive. And I want to tell you a couple of words about the Kishinev trial. You see, most of the people in tried in Kishinev, they were our friends, personal friends. From university and some from high school. David Chernoglas, who now lives in Israel. Arkady Voloshin, who lives in the United States. Alexander Goldfeld, who lives in Israel. Shimon Levit, he lives in Israel. Harry Kishner, David Rabinovich, and Hillel Shur. I unfortunately didn't have the photographs of the other two people, even though they were our friends, Alexander Galperin and Lazar Trachtenberg. They all were tried in Kishinev, and you can see on the photo how many years they were they spent in Russian prisons. So I wanted to tell you a story about the trial which was held in Kishinev in 1971, in June of 1971. Only family members of the defendants were allowed to attend the proceedings. Everybody else, it was behind closed door. The courtroom was filled with KGB agents. The verdicts were decided in advance, and judges just announced them. These 9 defendants were on trial, were kept in total isolation and didn't know what was going on in the world. Imagine being a prisoner in the inhumane Soviet system, which tries to break your spirit, force a false confession, make you think that you are all alone and the world has forgotten all about you. You are being intimidated and threatened with a long prison sentence. these people were our close friends. David Chernoglas was Alex's history teacher from Leningrad. His wife Bronya came to attend the trial as a family member, and she stayed with us in our two-room apartment. We gave Bronya, we heard about the gadgets, the electronics that were brought from the West into Soviet Union. So we got a Sony tape recorder. We gave it to Bronya. She put it in her purse and used to record the live court proceeding. Every day after the trial, she came back to our apartment and told us what happened this day in the courtroom. We would then go to the Central Post Office and call Volodya Slipak from a public phone. You met Volodya Slipak. He was our friend too. Volodya passed this information to the Western press correspondents. And the very same evening, or next morning, the Voice of Israel or Voice of America would transmit the latest news about the trial. Imagine a Jew living in Kishinev. Many Kishinev Jews who listened to these stations, and most of them did, in spite of these stations being often jammed. They would shake their heads and say with pride, we, meaning Israel, have our ears everywhere. Volodya Slipak was our link to the West. Another personal episode. Alex, myself, and 3 of our friends were called as witnesses in Kishinev trial. How would you go in front of the court after the KGB interrogations and intimidations? These were pretty regular with us. It's not a simple task. We decided we would keep our heads high. We dressed in white and blue with big Magen David on our, and we kept it all hidden before we entered the courtroom, so KGB would not be pre-warned and they would let us in. So we were dressed in the color of Israel flag, and we said, I refuse to provide testimony to this illegitimate court. I will speak of the events in Israel when I am allowed to go and live there. You should have seen the faces of our friends on the bench. They lit up with surprise and sheer delight. Our actions were aimed at showing them that they are not forgotten and that we are with them, and the world is with them, and it worked. It was well worth the risk and the consequences for us personally. We all had a special bond between us. The human chain was going from the show trial defendants through us, through Volodya Slipak in Moscow, and the Western media to Lou Rosenblum, Herb Karen, and volunteers at the West Temple who translated and typed up the news, cataloged and stored it. So 45 years later, we found it. I found it all in the Western Reserve Archive. When we were in Kishinev, we had no clue. We personally had no clue about the people in Cleveland. We learned about it much later, how much of their time and energy they spent supporting us. But they knew about us. We all were linked in the one human chain of the 20th century exodus. Luckily for us, we were kicked out of Kishinev in May of 1972. This coincided with President Nixon's visit to Russia. Only much later did we realize that we were expelled because of the heavy pressure the Soviets faced from the West. Other refuseniks in other cities of Soviet Union were kicked out at the same time. It was a result of Jackson-Vanik Amendment. This human chain that bonded the Soviet and the American Jews opened the gates for the modern Exodus. Today, when Israel is fighting an existential war, we should remember the movement which started here at this temple, and we remember the chain that bonds us with Israel. In conclusion, I just wanted to pass the greetings from our personal friends, common friends, Israel Palchan, who lives in Jerusalem, and David Chernaglas. His current name is David Maayan, who lives in Moshav Arugot in Israel. They both sent their greetings to this gathering, and I passed them on to Miriam. It's in Russian and in Hebrew. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Etsy. Today we've been hearing about an amazing chapter in the history of the Jewish people. The Soviet Jewry Movement overcame great odds to make possible one of the largest peaceful migrations of people in history. It truly was a modern-day exodus. This was a period that contains countless stories of heroism, determination, and resilience. Sadly, though, this chapter has largely been forgotten to everybody, except those who were personally involved, and that population is rapidly shrinking. The Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project was recently founded specifically to preserve and share the history, starting with what began here in Cleveland. And just like the grassroots Soviet Jewry Movement, the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project is also a grassroots effort, as it is called for short, SJMAP. SJMAP needs everyone's help to preserve these stories. SJMAP needs your help to inspire future generations with the lessons that the impossible can become possible. How, with your help, is SJMAP going to do this? First, we are tracking down the records of the grassroots Soviet Jewry movement and making sure they are in protected locations at universities, libraries, and historical centers. Then SJMAP is taking an important step in preservation to have this material digitized and coded. By cooperating with all these archival repositories and using this new and growing technology of digitization, SJMAP will be the virtual center for all the records of this grassroots human rights movement. The SJMAP Archival Hub will be the go-to place for scholars, teachers, and the public to explore these stories of activism and resilience. Our goal is to embed this chapter of history in college classrooms, in school curriculum, and in scholarly and popular publications. Using these stories, we want to inspire future generations to take a personal role in working towards human rights for all. An interesting and timely note, just last Sunday, a brand new interactive workshop teaching about the Soviet Jewry movement was piloted right here at Beth Israel Temple. A shout out to Sheldon Benjamin, who created and led the session, and to Jeff Heller's high school class who participated. SJMAP looks forward to many more such opportunities. We'll be raising funds to develop more curriculum that will share this history today and in the future. And a second timely note, the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project is about to begin its first digitization project. It should be no surprise that this will happen right here in Cleveland, where it all started. The Western Reserve Historical Society is the custodian, as has been mentioned, of the records of both the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism and the early years of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews. Together, SJMAP and the Western Reserve Historical Society are poised to begin this exciting initiative. Information and how you can support this project and make it possible are found in today's program booklet. For those of you watching online, the The information can also be found online at Soviet Jewry Archives, that's with an S, archives.org. And for those of you here in person, there also will be envelopes in the rear foyer if you'd like to take them with you. The passion of Cleveland's pioneers that then ignited this human rights movement with S.J. Mapp can continue to inspire future generations. And next, we will welcome John Grabowski, who's Senior Vice President for Research and Publications at the Western Reserve Historical Society. He's also the Krieger-Mueller Associate Professor of Applied History at Case Western, and we're also honored to have him as a member of the advisory board of the Soviet Jewry Movement Archives Project.
Thanks, Miriam, for that wonderful introduction, and thanks to all the presenters for reminding us just how important this organization is, was, and how important the archives are. For many years I've been an archivist, and when I would tell people what I did, it was like, so what? So what? And that's what we do. And Miriam mentioned a word, I hadn't titled my brief presentation today, but transformations is what it's about. It's not just about transformations with the Soviet Jewish movement, but it's transformations with the way people and organizations look at history and value history. And I'll start this on a bit of a personal note. I won't tell you how long I've been at the Historical Society, otherwise they would put me in the collections. I recall early in my career meeting with Judah Rubinstein, the historian at the Jewish Community Federation at that time. I was heading a new program at the Western Reserve Historical Society dedicated to collecting and preserving materials relating to the various ethnic communities in northeastern Ohio. You've got a name Grabowski, that's what you do. I've been focusing on records relating to the Jewish community, and everyone told me I had to meet Judah. How many of you remember Judah Rubinstein? Yep, I did. I met him. Sitting in his office at the Federation, I told him that the Historical Society was collecting Jewish records. His response was, the Historical Society is collecting Jewish records? Because that's the distance. It was a natural response given the old line lineage of the WRHS at that point. Judah and I talked. We soon became very good friends. I miss him greatly. And he became an advocate for the program. His interest and that of Howard Berger at the Federation brought seed funding from several families, including the Grees and Ratner families, that allowed us to hire our first Jewish history archivist in 1976. We are on now, I think, Sean, you are archivist number 7. And so this has been a continuity since 1976 that we would reach out to the Jewish community and collect their records. And it's been important. From that date in 1976 to now, the Historical Society's had a Jewish history archivist working on a task that is currently well supported, now fully endowed. And it has served as a model for other communities who have worked with us to raise money to create an endowment so that their history can be preserved as well. This short story is important for several reasons. WRHS is one of the few secular historical agencies to which a Jewish community has entrusted its history. And as a non-Jew, I think that is remarkable. And that just puts this in a perspective that shows change. It represents an enormous change in focus that the Historical Society underwent nearly 5 decades ago. Without that change, the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism records would not have come to WRHS, and neither would Sean or any of the archivists who had preceded him. It was Lou Rosenblum who brought the collection to the Society in 1983, and I think Scott Klein was our archivist at that point. We knew that it was a very important acquisition, but then we received another gift from Evie and Lou, because Evie and Lou both soon thereafter became longtime volunteers at the Western Reserve Historical Society. I dare say that memory of Lou and Evie working in the library is something that I, my colleagues, will long cherish. Both became close friends, and their presence enriched all of us who worked alongside them. We miss them both. We miss them greatly. Today, the archive of the Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism stands as one of the small number of collections held at the Society that truly transcends the local and the national. Western Reserve Historical Society is very much about northeastern Ohio, but there are things that happen here that come up and shake the world, and this is one of them. Certainly other collections at the Society link Greater Cleveland to significant movements and events in the nation. But very few can be ranked as the seed of an international movement, and most particularly an international movement focused on human rights. Certainly we have papers of senators and representatives who worked on global initiatives. But if I were to pick another collection at the Historical Society that comes on par with the CCSA's reach, it would probably be the papers of Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. So we're looking at the birth of Israel. We're looking at everything that was happening in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. So the two of these, in a way, mesh wonderfully. That aside, what has to resonate with each one of us is the internal story of the CCSA. We've heard that today. It was started here by ordinary, albeit extraordinary individuals, and ultimately resulted in what one might call a major geopolitical shift in policy. When our city, Cleveland, looks for superlatives, and we always do these lists as happen in Cleveland, the council has to be on that list. It must be on that list. So if you see another list and it's not on, ring somebody's bell. It shows that individuals who believe in a cause can engineer change. Okay. Here's my page. There we go, Grabowski. I will close by noting that in the desperately troubled times in which we now live, we need to look again to individuals who are willing to do what seems to be impossible. That's what a cadre of Jewish scientists at NASA and other young professionals did. They made the impossible possible, and we celebrate and thank them for what they achieved. Then, too, who would have thought that an old line establishment in Cleveland, like the Western Reserve Historical Society, would become the repository not only of the Jewish community's history, but of almost every other community in Greater Cleveland? That's what has kept me working at that institution for many years, and that's the magic of the institution. And the magic of the institution is its collection is just spectacular. It's more than a collection, it's lives that are embedded in those papers and documents. There's a story there. Archives are not dull. Archives are about life. Thank you.
I'm Rabbi Enid Lader, and I was rabbi here at Beth Israel-The West Temple over the last 11 years, and during that time, I had the wonderful opportunity to help be on a committee that brought to fruition a wonderful Ohio historical marker. On Friday, March 22nd, 2019, I received this email from Miriam Rosenblum. Hi, Enid. I thought you'd like to see this new piece of West Cleveland Jewish history that will be going live at the clevelandjewishhistory.net website, courtesy of Arnie Berger. There is a nice shout out about Beth Israel-The West Temple. Note Arnie's comment at the end of the entry proposing the idea of erecting an Ohio historic marker at 14308 Triscuit Road, documenting the location of the very first Soviet Jewry advocacy organization. It is an intriguing idea. Shabbat Shalom, Miriam. Intriguing indeed. Yet, it took me about a week and a half to respond to Miriam and to Arnie. On April 2nd, I wrote, Thanks for sharing this with me, Miriam, and thanks to Arnie also. I think a designation of the importance of our Beth Israel-The West Temple in the history of the Soviet Jewry movement would be amazing, and yes, it will take some discussion. Miriam, I did want to share with you and with your dad that this Shabbat's bat mitzvah girl's father and his family were Soviet emigres. This is the first of 4 families in our congregation celebrating their child's and grandchild's b'nai mitzvah. And next Tuesday, I am finishing the conversion process for a young woman who was born in Ukraine and whose grandmother was Jewish. The parents' religion was math and science, and she is reclaiming her spiritual heritage. The best thing is that while we are an important historical spot, we are also a vibrant center for Jewish life on Cleveland's west side. With love and wishes for all the best to you all, Enid. And on April 4th, 2019, Lou Rosenblum passed away. I then heard from Arnie that if we wanted to apply for the historical marker, we only had a 2-month window. We needed to find out if the congregation was okay with making this application and then form a committee. Our committee would come to include Peter Sackett, president of our board at that time, Ehi Ganin, former Soviet dissident and great organizer on behalf of sharing the story of Soviet Jewry, Kelly Falcone Hall, president and CEO of Western Reserve Historical Society, Sean Martin and John Grabowski, to lend their wisdom from the Historical Society's Jewish archives, Debbie Klein, the point person for the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Community Federation of Cleveland, Arnie Berger, historian extraordinaire from our Cleveland's Jewish community, myself as rabbi of the congregation. I took notes and helped with organizing. And Miriam, whose personal knowledge and attention to a tremendous amount of details really served as the foundation for making the case that the Soviet Jewry movement did indeed start right here at Beth Israel-The West Temple. Through our then councilman, Marty Keene, we received a proclamation titled, Cleveland's Beth Israel-The West Temple, Pioneers of the Movement to Free Soviet Jews, signed by then Mayor Frank Jackson from the city of Cleveland and acknowledging the founding of the movement here. I am very pleased that our present councilman, Charles Slife, is with us today and has organized another proclamation from the city of Cleveland in recognition of the 60th anniversary of the founding of the Soviet Jewry Movement and the wonderful contributions of the thousands of new Clevelanders who emigrated to our city. Councilman Slife, could you come up, please?
Be brief because I know no one came to hear a politician speak. So my name is Charles, and I have the opportunity and pleasure to serve this neighborhood on the west side of Cleveland on Cleveland City Council. And we do these proclamations. This is a resolution of recognition for occasions that are worth recognizing. And Rabbi, I don't think it would be unsurprising to say that when people think of the Jewish community in Cleveland, they often don't think of the West Side, right? If anyone's familiar. But not only is this something to recognize that this community, this congregation is here, but has also done tremendous work to change the world and to bring so many people the opportunity to practice their faith, to live in freedom. I won't read this entire thing because I can't read. But one thing that it does spell out is just momentarily going even beyond the Soviet Jewry movement and this congregation. There continues to be an apparatus within Cleveland and cities across the country to help people who continue to need to flee where they live, to seek safety, freedom of religion, freedom from persecution. And that movement within Northeast Ohio really has its roots in this movement here. And so I say today, people continue to come to this country, to come to this city because of the hard work that was built starting in the 1960s right here in this building, in this community. And I know that's not the focal point of the celebration, but that was not the intent in 1963, but I think that you should all be so proud that this work continues today, and there are refugees living in this community that owe a debt of gratitude to everyone here and to all of you. So I present you with this, and then I will get out of your way. But thank you so much for letting me be a brief part of today's ceremony. So.
Thank you so much. We truly appreciate your presence. So our application was complete. Additional resources were included, wording for both sides of the marker. We sent in our application in time that July and waited, and waited, and waited, and then received this letter in September from Laura Russell, the Historical Markers Coordinator, Local History Services of the Ohio History Connection. Good afternoon, she wrote. It is my pleasure to inform you that your application for an Ohio historical marker has been accepted into our program. Attached is our official notification letter. We appreciate your patience as we read through all 70 applications received this year and worked with several committees to decide the final 27 applications accepted into the program. Congratulations. I look forward to working with you over the next year to turn your application into a marker. Laura. And indeed, she did. More work on the wording. Thanks so much to Miriam for her diligent editing. And then, on March 11th, 2020, COVID. Everything was shut down, including the foundry to create the marker. But on Friday, January 29th, 2021, the marker arrived and stayed in Rick Keller's garage until the ground had thawed so it could be set in its place. Planning a dedication proved to be challenging, but I am so tremendously pleased that we have come together today to formally dedicate the Ohio Historical Marker, a modern-day exodus, and the beautiful brick plaza designed by Brian Friedman, which surrounds it. On one side, it reads, "Here in 1963, congregants of Beth Israel-The West Temple, led by Louis Rosenblum, Herb Karen, and Rabbi Daniel Litt, founded the Cleveland Committee, later Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism, the first American organization created to advocate for freedom for Soviet Jews. In 1970, this work led to the formation of the Union of Councils for Soviet Jews under the leadership of Louis Rosenblum. The UCSJ, whose national office was located here from 1970 to 1973, became the largest independent Soviet Jewry organization in the world. By the turn of the 21st century, the efforts begun here helped 1.6 million Jews leave the former Soviet Union." And on side 2, it reads, "In the years between 1975 and 2003, an estimated 10,000 Soviet Jews were resettled in Cleveland. The Jewish Federation of Cleveland, the Jewish Family Service Association, and other social agencies, schools, congregations, and thousands of volunteers helped these new Americans acclimate to American and Jewish life. These agencies and volunteers provided help finding housing and employment and education in Jewish traditions. They and their children now live in freedom, enriching our region." The Oxford Dictionary defines a dedication as a ceremony to mark the official completion or opening of something, as our marker. Dedication, the noun, is defined as the hard work and effort that somebody puts into an activity or a purpose because they think it is important. Don Bogart, may his memory be a blessing, when asked about what it took to make this movement so successful, answered with, "You have to feel it burning in your gut." And he included the hand motion too. Indeed, the fire and the passion that drove Lou and Don and Dan and Herb and so many more burned brightly and provided the light that would illuminate the path to freedom for 1.6 million Jews. Today, we not only dedicate this marker, but let us dedicate ourselves to making a positive difference in our world. It is truly a Shehechianu moment. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, Shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who has kept us alive, sustained us, and brought us to this very, very special occasion. Thank you.
As we move toward the closing of today's gathering, I'd like to offer two prayers. One is a blessing directed toward everybody who was involved in making today happen, starting in the late 50s. Anybody who was involved in the Social Action Committee that spun off into the Cleveland Committee on Soviet Anti-Semitism, which grew into the Council of Soviet, I'm blanking on exactly what thank you, Soviet Anti-Semitism, to anybody who was involved in making today specifically happen, the people who moved toward getting the marker created, putting the marker in the front of our building, and planning or implementing today. I would like to ask you to rise if you're here. And if you're home, if you're streaming, you can also stand up. Oh, don't. Yeah, we can clap. No, I want to actually bless you. So stay standing. Misha Beirach Avotenu Abraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov v'imotenu Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah. May God, who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless this community and all holy communities. They, their families, and all that is theirs, along with all who faithfully devoted themselves to the needs of this community and to the needs of all humanity. Whether that need was to free the captive back then or to free the captive now, to feed the hungry, house the homeless, clothe the naked, bring about peace, and ultimately to help each of us see that every single one of us is created in God's image and worthy of care and respect. May the Holy One reward them, bless them with the fruits of wisdom and understanding, fulfillment and joy. May God bless them by making their worthy endeavors prosper, as well as those of the entire people Israel and those of all people everywhere. And let us say, Amen. And I'd like to offer one more blessing. I know you're all sitting down. I'm going to ask everybody to please stand up. This is a blessing for peace, based on the words of the great Hasidic master, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Yehi ratzon milfanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei avotenu v'imotenu. May it be your will, God of our ancestors, that we see the day when war and bloodshed cease, when a great peace will embrace the whole world. Then nation will not lift up sword against nation, neither will they know war anymore. For all who live on earth will realize we have not come into being to hate or destroy. We have come into being to praise, to labor, and to love. Compassionate God, bless the leaders of all nations with the power of compassion. Fulfill the promise conveyed in Scripture. I will bring peace to the land, and you will lie down, and no one will terrify you. I will rid the land of vicious beasts, and it shall not be ravaged by war. Let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. Let God's peace fill the earth as waters fill the sea. And let us say, Amen. You may be seated.
And now we turn to a song led by our musicians Wendy Karen, Jim Karen, and Gene Epstein. The Cleveland Council on Soviet Anti-Semitism, as we said, was formed 60 years ago this month, October 1963. Beyond Cleveland, many others were also asking questions and initiating action. On the East Coast in New York City, Jacob Yaakov Birnbaum began to light fires of activism. And in May '64, he founded the Student Struggle for Soviet Jews. By '65, Birnbaum was looking for a song to energize the growing Soviet Jewry movement. And the result is Am Yisrael Chai, the people of Israel live. And it resonates even more today. Oh,
You have words?
yes. The words are in your program.
Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. 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 Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael Chai. Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael, Am Yisrael. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu, oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu Chai. Oh, Rabbeinu
Thank you. Thank you to everyone who joined us today to share the history, anecdotes, and music that composes this amazing history. The preservation of this inspirational history continues, as does the important work to share these stories. You can learn more about the preservation effort, and you can donate to support this work at SovietJewryArchives.org. For those of you attending this program in person, I encourage you to visit the Ohio History Marker in front of the building, which stands as a permanent reminder of the good works that began here. For those of you watching from afar, we hope you will view the historical marker online, also at SovietJewryArchives.org. Many in today's audience participated in the Soviet Jewry Movement from both sides. After the formal program has ended, I invite everyone here at Beth Israel to linger, enjoy the refreshments provided by the temple, and to chat with those heroes who are with us here today, and to help us continue to preserve and share these stories. Thank you.